Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, where today we are going to be talking about key developments and trending issues and topics in the FDA space. I'm Kate Hardey. I'm a partner in the McGuireWoods Charlotte office. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Royce B and Tim Loveland. They are both out of our Chicago office, and we're looking forward to giving everybody a packed information on updates in the FDA space today. All right, so I just want to can everybody see, I'm hoping everybody can see the agenda. Today we're going to talk about several different topics. We're going to start with the FDA's fairly recent compounding pharmacy memorandum of understanding, and we're going to discuss how those will impact 503A and 503B pharmacies. All right, and I see we're having a little technical. Can somebody advance the slide for me, since my my slide thing does not seem to be actually, let me try this. Sorry, y'all. Okay, are we on the right slide now? Okay, my apologies. So after we talk about the compounding pharmacy, we will talk about a little bit of what's happening in the FDA and the leadership transition under the Biden administration. There's been some interesting developments in the False Claims Act space related to FDA violations. We're going to talk about those. There's also been some recent enforcement in the clinical trial space from the FDA perspective. We're going to cover that. We'll also cover a brief update on some of the drug pricing proposals that are still floating out there. We're going to talk about, along those lines, pharmacy benefit managers and state legislation. And then last but not least, we will cover the topic of FDA and CBD, and we'll talk about different types of CBD products and what's legal, what's not legal, and how to be thinking about those. And if we could advance to the next slide, onto the FDA compounding memorandum. And here, as you all may be aware, in October of 2020, FDA published its memorandum of understanding. And this is something that has been in development for quite some time. It's been out there for several years for comments. And what this is an agreement between the FDA and state boards of pharmacy, whereby state boards of pharmacy are picking up some oversight and enforcement of compounding pharmacies. And just to review that briefly, as most folks are probably aware, there's two main types of compounding pharmacies. There are 503A compounding pharmacies and 503B compounding pharmacies. 503A compounding pharmacies are pharmacies that are compounding prescriptions on a per patient basis based on patient need. There's one set of regulations that cover those. 503B compounding pharmacies are called outsourcing facilities. These types of compounding pharmacies are doing much more high-level, high volume compounding, and there's much higher and stricter regulations for those. But the key things to know about this is, first of all, the MOU is optional. So at this point, all state boards of pharmacy have 1 year to determine whether or not they will sign the MOU. And we're going to walk through real quickly here what it means if the state signs the MOU and what it means if they don't. And the big concern for a lot of these pharmacies is the MOU will restrict shipping of compounded products. And the biggest part of that is restrictions on shipping for out-of-state compounded products. So the key things to be thinking about here is if a state signs the MOU, what this does is it says the 503A pharmacy can't ship inordinate amounts of compounded drugs out of the state in which they are compounded. And there's a whole calculation that has to take place to figure out if you're shipping too much compounded product. And this takes into consideration not only the number of compounded products that are shipped from the pharmacy out of state to other patients, it also takes into account the number of prescriptions that are actually dispensed from the pharmacy, picked up by the patient in the state. The MOU goes through the calculation and how that is put together. There's been a lot of confusion about how this number is going to be compounded, and we'll talk, or calculated, and we'll talk about current lawsuit that's going on. But that is what pharmacies will have to be thinking about. And we'll just mention here real quickly, for compounding pharmacies, there's also limitations on compounding what's called inordinate amounts of a commercial copy of an available drug. That is different and not covered by the MOU. The MOU is solely focused on how much compounded product is shipped out of state. And if we could move to the next slide, please. So this slide outlines the key things you'll need to know for a state that does sign the MOU or does not sign the MOU. If the state does sign the MOU, as I mentioned, the state is basically agreeing with FDA. We will try to monitor with you the number of prescriptions that are being shipped out of state. We will report information back to you, and we will let you know if we think a pharmacy is going beyond that 50% limit. If a state does not sign the MOU, that 50% number goes all the way down to 5. It's the same exact calculation, but the limit on shipping is now 5%. So that is a big deal for pharmacies in certain states where most of their business may be shipping product out of state. So just to touch briefly on pharmacy investment considerations, because this is still a little bit of an unknown, it's important to understand if you're looking at a pharmacy, how are the prescriptions shipped out of state? Where are they shipped? Is it in a state that's close by? Are they in states that are not close by? But this is important to be thinking about. It's also important to be monitoring what is happening or what states are thinking at this point where the product is going to be shipped. And if we can move to the next slide, please. On this next slide, we've got here, so at this point, one state, New Hampshire, has officially agreed that it is going to sign on to the MOU. This other slide here shows what states are potentially thinking about as far as whether or not they want to sign the MOU, and there is a link to the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy to get to this tracking that they have here. So you can see there are some states that have already said no, there's some that are still thinking about it. I believe California may have decided at a recent board meeting that they are going to sign on, but there's a lot that's happening with the states, and it's very important to be tracking what's going on, particularly if you're looking at investing in a compounding pharmacy. And if I could go to the next slide, please. And so the last thing here to note is, as you may have seen, there is a lawsuit that has been filed by several different compounding pharmacies. The The complaint is actually publicly available if you're interested in Googling and reading the complaint. A lot of the complaint is tied into potential consumer harm if there are limits on the restrictions for shipping out of state as currently set forth. This case is still ongoing. There's been no decision yet. Unclear if a decision is going to be made anytime before October, when this memorandum of understanding is set to go into effect. So a little bit up in the air, but in the meantime, it's important to keep tracking this to see what's happening if you're interested in investing in this space. And I'm going to turn it over, if we could move to the next slide, to Royce, who is going to talk about what is happening currently in FDA leadership and the transition in the Biden administration for FDA.
Yeah, and can we just advance one more slide real quick? Perfect, thanks. So, you know, we're revisiting this, you know, into President Biden's presidency, and we've seen appointments and we've seen leadership positions filled in other parts of government, but FDA has been lagging behind significantly. And we really thought that we were going to have, you know, someone leading the agency at this point that was not in an interim role or interim basis, especially given COVID-19. The emphasis on healthcare and the role FDA has to play in that. And we really haven't seen anything happen. And, you know, that's significant because right now the position is being filled by, you know, an agency insider, you know, old school fixture in Washington, and we haven't really gotten fresh leadership in at FDA, especially during this time. It's taken a hit with the departure of Amy Abernathy, who was FDA's principal deputy commissioner, acting chief information officer. She was heading the CBD task force. And so what I'm trying to say here is I don't think we're going to see anything revelatory from FDA on a lot of areas that we would want to see innovation on, such as CBD, a better idea of what FDA's role is to play in drug pricing and more rapid drug approvals. But as you can imagine, COVID is taking the front seat, the vaccine's taking the front seat, and COVID EUA approvals are taking the front seat. And that gives us, as, you know, people in industry who may not, you know, look, we spend a lot of time on COVID and a lot of time on COVID EUAs and everything that is, you know, unfortunately happening with COVID here, but we're not going to see the kind of wish list of items that we would want, and we're also anxiously waiting whether or not we're going to get someone from industry and FDA, or if we're going to get, you know, as we thought might be the case, you know, FDA regular, for lack of a better word, that's going to take a very, you know, kind of stale position to FDA's role, enforcement, and, you know, the position of the agency. So it's definitely a stay tuned, and, you know, hold your breath to hope that, you know, when the president gets done test driving Ford F-150s, which is all well and good, he decides to appoint a new head of FDA. And we can move on to the next slide. Tim?
Yeah. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about some high-level False Claims Act enforcement that we've been seeing in the medical device side that have been initiated by whistleblowers. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, just to step back and take a 30,000-foot view as to what the False Claims Act is. Are we on the brief overview slide? Okay, great. So generally speaking, whistleblowers have the ability to file qui tam lawsuits on behalf of the government in order to recover money that may have been obtained through some fraudulent or improper practice and method. The Federal False Claims Act imposes liability against persons who submit false or fraudulent claims to the government, or in this case, as is relevant, who cause false or fraudulent claims to be submitted or who conspire to submit false and fraudulent claims. So this is really not intended to be just limited to providers who are directly billing Medicare, but also to fraudulent or improper practices of manufacturers and distributors of medical devices and pharmaceuticals as well. So relators or whistleblowers typically receive a portion of that recovery, typically between 15 and 30%. And then the false claims context penalties can typically range pretty considerably. It can amount to repayment of the amount with interest. It can amount to tens of thousands of dollars for each violation, plus up to 3 times the amount of damages. And then it also may result in potential exclusion from participation in a federal or state health care program, and may also include restitution, fines, forfeitures, things like that. Next slide, please. Okay. So the FDA's position on off-label use for marketed drugs and biologics and medical devices, typically the FDA and other regulators at the federal level have given physicians considerable discretion when they're in the use of medical devices and medications for off-label purposes. The general principle is that doctors can use medical devices and pharmaceuticals and biologics for off-label purposes, even for contraindicated uses if they believe that the use is medically reasonable and necessary. So the FDA has targeted certain risk areas that are associated with medical device and pharmaceutical companies with respect to promoting their drugs for off-label use. Next slide, please. So some of these risk areas that the FDA has targeted include potential to skew clinical decision-making, undermine clinical integrity of formulary process, kickbacks, increased costs to program beneficiaries, potential to increase overutilization or improper utilization, and obviously the FDA's principal concern with patient safety and quality of care concerns. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's various theories through which False Claims Act cases can proceed. We discussed a couple of these below. This is relevant in understanding some of the more recent decisions that have come down and looking at some of the settlements that have been undertaken. So generally speaking, to secure FDA approval for a drug or device, a manufacturer must demonstrate that the product is safe and effective for each of its intended use or substantially equivalent to a previously approved device. And the key here really is understanding what the intended use is, as contrasted with the contraindicated use or the off-label use. So, like for example, one theory with respect to unapproved products, if a manufacturer encourages sales representatives to promote unapproved products illegally, or if in the next theory, if a manufacturer encourages sales representatives to promote products off-label, there could be some potential liability there. In addition, there's a theory known as Fraud-on-the-FDA, which has been whereby if a manufacturer obtains approval for a specific intended use but promotes a product solely for an off-label use, there may be some additional liability there as well.
And Tim, this is Kate. I'm going to chime in here real quickly before you move to the next slide, because I know you've got some more details on a recent case. But I think one important thing to be thinking about this is where a lot of companies get hung up or have bad facts. There's a lot of companies that, of course, have policies and procedures that say, we absolutely do not promote off-label. We will train our sales reps not to promote off-label. But if that's going on in the field and there are text messages between sales reps, if there's any emails that encourage this type of thing, or discuss sales quotas. There are a lot of different factors that the government can be looking at to show an intent to promote off-label. And I think, and it may be coming up in your next slide, one of these cases, the government can look at, just to what Tim was talking about, if your product is approved for this type of label and the government pulls all the sales on your product and your product is sold only to types of providers who would not be using your product for a labeled use, that's another way where the government would say, well, you're only selling, look how many people have bought this. It clearly is an off-label use. You have to be promoting it this way. So I just wanted to jump in and kind of add on that a little bit, and I'll let you move on to the next slide.
Yep, thank you. That's very helpful. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just wanted to make a note of some of the recent cases with respect to unapproved products and improper promotion. And there was a company that recently allegedly purchased, marketed, and sold devices that weren't approved for or cleared for use by the FDA. The company essentially admitted that from 2007 to 2014, they sold devices for which the manufacturer didn't obtain any sort of clearance or approval from the FDA to market the products. And it was relying on a pre-amendment status exemption to the market, the period being 1976 exemption. And then that, however, that lacked the required evidence to demonstrate that the device is actually qualified for the pre-amendment status exemption. So the next one notes a circumstance where a medical device company allegedly marketed and sold devices that were not approved and cleared, also noting the pre-market approval and clearance requirements for that. The company actually recalled the device in this case, but they were nevertheless fined because they were heavily marketing and promoting uncleared devices. The uncleared devices were used by various medical providers and were marketed for purposes of spinal surgeries, circumcisions, and various other medical procedures. In this case, the providers submitted claims for reimbursement to Medicare and Medicaid for those procedures, despite the fact that those products hadn't been marketed or had been marketed without approval or clearance from the FDA. Hence the False Claims Act fit. And then the final one that we wanted to note was a recent $12 million settlement in which a medical device maker allegedly marketed it's a topical wound powder for an unapproved non-topical purpose. Not only did they market it for off-label use, they made various misrepresentations as to what the intended use was and provided inaccurate codes for procedures to providing physicians. They paid various kickbacks through a number of different kickback schemes, such as taking physicians out to special dinners and things like that. And then they also initiated a market withdrawal due to a product's contamination and then failed to report that withdrawal to the FDA. So there was quite a litany of issues in that one. And then the final one, next slide, please. The final one I wanted to make note of here was the Fraud-on-the-FDA False Claims Act claim. This was in relation to a whistleblower who alleged the device company had fraudulently obtained a 510K clearance for certain spinal injury implants by essentially falsely representing the intended use. And the reason this was of particular concern here was the device allegedly, according to the complaint, could not be used in any capacity for the use that was actually indicated on the 510K, and the product was marketed solely and exclusively and billed solely and exclusively by providers who were using the product for the off-label use and contraindicated use. So the whistleblower was allowed to proceed in the Ninth Circuit on the theory that the devices were not properly approved or cleared by the FDA, and that the company essentially fraudulently obtained a 510K clearance for a use which it essentially had no, which was based on fraud, effectively. So there were some additional claim dismissals by the Ninth Circuit with respect to deficiencies in the allegation for medically unreasonable or unnecessary off-label use, and then also for improper rebate agreements. But the key here, I think, to understand was that the court noted that the whistleblower was not merely alleging off-label use, but they were solely using for the contraindicated only use, which was not approved by the FDA, which amounted to fraud on the FDA. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to Royce to talk a little bit about the clinical trial enforcement.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So, you know, if like a couple of years ago, we can go to the next slide real quick. You know, a couple of years ago, if you asked me, like, you know, what are the penalties related to clinicaltrials.gov, I'd be like, all right, that's kind of like a legal hypothetical there. Like, no one, yes, there was a requirement to be on clinicaltrials.gov, and just as a refresher, clinicaltrials.gov is the, you know, massive online website where the, you know, sponsor of a clinical trial, whether investigator-initiated or sponsor-initiated, you had to list your clinical trial, be out there in the open, say what phase it's on, what sites are recruiting, a whole lot of information. And yeah, there've been, you know, laws and statutes and regulations on this for a while, and you know, I routinely go through clinicaltrials.gov in the past and just find stale information, or maybe information that wasn't updated as frequently as it should have. And it was kind of, you know, like as people in industry, we'd always regulate, you know, the risk of not listing on clinicaltrials.gov is kind of like a, yeah, it's there, you should do it, let's, you know, make sure our studies are up there and everything's okay. Well, that's not the case anymore. You know, FDA, August 2020, released a guidance saying we're going to start looking at clinical trial enforcement and not listing on clinicaltrials.gov more seriously. There are some provisions in the law with bite on them for not listing. And then recently we saw, and my colleagues Andrea Lina and Kate Hardey published recently a great client alert on this, so you know, read that if you want more information. But FDA cited a seller on I think I'm saying that right, a seller on pharmaceuticals for failure to submit clinical trial results, you know, within a year of listing, or a year of completion. And the reason we're talking about this is because there's a relationship to what's going on in the next slide, which is about the enforcement side of this. But it's a really low-hanging fruit as a sponsor to get your stuff into clinicaltrials.gov, make sure that your, you know, physicians, if you're sponsoring some investigator-initiated research, are getting it in there, because the ramifications of it are quite intense. There's civil fines, there's this nasty letter from FDA saying that you're not doing it, and we're really thinking that there's going to be a lot more enforcement here on the part of FDA, which is, you know, going parallel with some of the more aggressive enforcement we're seeing from the Department of Justice, because, you know, FDA's position here is that there's a reason for clinicaltrials.gov, there's a reason you need to be declaring your clinical trials, and there's a reason why there needs to be transparency in this process. And other government agencies look towards it too as saying, you know, we're ferreting out the Pepsi challenges, not that there's a problem with the Pepsi challenge, but we're ferreting out, you know, research that isn't empirical, scientific, or is going to lead somewhere, and just looks kind of like a, you know, a joke to, you know, impress a physician that we like a lot. I'm not saying that that happens widespread though. So what can you do? You know, as a sponsor, you know, really take this as a sign of future enforcement. Make sure that you've got an internal policy that ensures that every single, you know, trial site that you're working with is, you know, on there. Your trials are listed on there. make sure that, if you're a physician or another healthcare provider that may be conducting research, that you know that the person or the entity sponsoring you has the study on there. And look, yeah, there's some exceptions on why you may not list on Triails.gov, and we're not going to go into that here. It's not as though everything needs to be on there, but the vast majority of research on human subjects needs to be in Triails.gov. So, and remember that it's really the sponsor's responsibility to be on there unless it's, some form of investigator-initiated research. So really low-hanging fruit for compliance, but somewhere where we're seeing FDA take more enforcement, which gets us into our next slide. Okay, so we're like time warping now. Miami, the 1980s, things are going crazy. There's a lot of drug money. That's not where we are, though, but it's similar to a lot of money is happening right now in Miami. DOJ is getting really interested in this new way to make money on the south side of, the state of Florida, which is fraudulent clinical trials. And we've got, enforcement by the DOJ in the clinical trial space is kind of the way it was with FDA also, which is we just didn't really see it. There's so many other things DOJ can do with healthcare fraud. But, statements were made late last year by the DOJ Consumer Protection Branch Director, Gus Eiler, who specifically singled out in a conference that clinical trial fraud was a key area of drug and device enforcement, and that DOJ was very concerned that there was junk science out there. And this kind of goes along with some of the stuff we've seen published in, Nature or JAMA or other magazines that talks about, is our, are drug approvals riddled with, either intentionally falsified data or inaccurate data. And what we're talking about here goes beyond just having a, FDA or Cites sponsored, investigator come out there and, ding you for not getting some signatures on an informed consent. Yeah, that's a big deal, but this is beyond that. This is, in the cases that we're talking about here, these are intentional acts by physicians to falsify clinical study data. And, one would be asking, why are they doing that? Well, clinical studies are lucrative. Sometimes they can, as a site, you can get hundreds of thousands of dollars for doing a good trial. And as a site, you want to maintain your reputation. You don't want to, fail to get a trial because your recruitment wasn't great, or fail to get another trial because, one of your study employees messed up and, administered a study drug to someone else. The narrative that you want, if you're really trying to go after fraud in this space, or you're a bad actor, is you want to show that your site is awesome, it's recruiting awesome, it's, the patients, the results coming from your site are better than any other of the sites, and it's stat padding. And that's exactly what the individuals in the South Florida got indicted for and convicted for was, and this is multiple sites, this isn't just one bad actor. And it's really interesting that, this action has been happening in South Florida, and I think the reason that is because there's a lot of physicians in South Florida, large elderly population, a lot of opportunity to conduct clinical trials. So it's a huge shift for DOJ, and I don't know if it's limited to just South Florida. It doesn't sound like it is, but as a sponsor, what can you do? As a sponsor, know your investigators, know what's going on. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And if you're seeing a site that is doing high volume of studies, not just your study, but everyone in town is using them, and they seem to always be getting the right recruitment on really difficult studies for recruitment, pause and question that and see, okay, let's look at the data independently and let's do our own review and see what's going on. Not widespread, it's not rampant, but it shows that DOJ is really interested in this in ways that it wasn't in the past. And Kate, I think I'm going back to you.
Yep. If we could flip to the next slide. I'm just going to spend a minute talking about what is happening with drug pricing proposals, there's not a lot to report on here. We'll just kind of review. I mean, things are still out there. It's an important topic, but nothing, the needle hasn't moved too far yet. And if we could just move to the next slide. I'll just give a quick overview. As I mentioned, there's multiple proposals ongoing. There have been multiple hearings about this. I think the overarching theme is the Biden administration appears to be focused on drug pricing issues, as was the Trump administration. Drug prices are expensive. There is some data that says, the government spending may be 47% of U.S. drug spending this year. It's expensive for the government. A lot of drugs are expensive for patients. When you watch the news, you really can't miss that there's been several hearings with some of the larger drug manufacturers about how they have increased costs over the last several years. And I think the government's trying to piece all that together. So briefly, the Biden administration just reintroduced a bill that had been introduced at the end of the last administration. It is looking to basically tie prices to prices for drug products in other countries, so that there would be specific limits on the maximum price. It would also implement penalties, both civil tax penalties for manufacturers that fail to comply, and it would also require manufacturers to issue rebates for drugs that cost over $100. There's a lot of different pieces to this. This is similar to other things that were proposed by the Trump administration. I think it's a little bit difficult to really figure out how to match up all those prices against different countries in a timely manner, but we'll see how that bill plays out. And just to note a couple other ones, right before the end of the Trump administration, there were a few proposed rules about addressing manufacturer rebates and how those may change. Other things that are being considered as well to address drug pricing, in addition to some drug price demonstration projects that CMS has going on, we have seen some discussion about possibly making changes to billing codes to address things there. And then states have also considered different types of legislation to try to bring down drug prices to the extent that they can. And that piece ties in a little bit to what Tim is going to talk about next, if we could move on. And he's going to talk about pharmacy benefit managers and some of the state legislation that's happening there. So we will cover that, and then we will move on and get to the juicy topic of CBD. But Tim, I will turn it over to you to talk about the pharmacy benefit manager issues.
Great, thank you. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, the pharmacy benefit managers generally act as intermediaries between the pharmacies and prescription drug plans, and generally will reimburse pharmacies for the cost of drugs that are associated with those plans. So when PBMs are determining the reimbursement rate for each drug, they usually develop and administer like a maximum allowable cost, or MAC lists, that are distributed to the various state Medicaid programs that work with them. So the purpose of talking through some of these components today is we want to talk a little bit about the Rutledge decision, which came down in December 2020 for the United States Supreme Court. Talked a little bit about this dynamic and with respect to an Arkansas law that was challenged under ERISA, and talk a little bit about kind of what some of the new regulations that we might be seeing in regulating PBMs are coming in. And we're seeing quite a lot of movement on a state level. We're not going to get into some of the specifics, but just generally wanted to talk about the trend as a whole. So with respect to the Rutledge decision, back in 2015, Arkansas passed what was known as Act 900, for the purpose of limiting the cost of drug prices. It effectively required PBMs to reimburse Arkansas pharmacies at a price that was either equal to or higher than the pharmacy's wholesale costs. So generally speaking, the Act 900 required PBMs to update their MAC lists when the drug wholesale prices increase, and to provide pharmacies with an administrative appeal procedure in order to challenge MAC reimbursement rates if they felt that they were not getting the appropriate reimbursement. And it also permitted Arkansas pharmacies to refuse to sell a drug if the reimbursement rate was lower than the acquisition cost. So PCMA, the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association, which represents some of the biggest PBMs in the country, challenged the laws being preempted by ERISA. Again, for those of you not familiar, ERISA is a law that generally preempts state laws that quote unquote relate to employee benefits, which also include health benefits. ERISA has been used in a number of circumstances to overturn various state laws in this area, and has been used in large part to limit states from being able to pass various laws that regulate those health plans. In this case, the court ruled, found 8-0 that ERISA did not preempt the Arkansas law. And Justice Sotomayor wrote the opinion. It's actually quite helpful. Lists the exact types of state healthcare laws that ERISA doesn't preempt. Let me go ahead and give you a couple quick examples. Laws that require plans to cover specific benefits, laws that bind plan administrators to specific rules for determining beneficiary status, and then laws that create acute and indirect economic effects that force the plan to adopt a certain scheme of coverage. With respect to the Arkansas law, this really was a true rate regulation attempt by a state, and the court effectively found that it avoids ERISA preemption because it doesn't tell the plans and the PBMs that what they have to cover and who they have to cover, but it essentially just regulates the cost of the items and the services that are covered. So it leaves a lot of running room for the states to pursue various policies that control healthcare costs and to improve affordability for consumers. So, you know, effectively, Rutledge narrows the range of state regulations that are preempted by ERISA, and it kind of opens the pathway for states to pass additional laws that address the PBM reimbursement practices directly. Some examples of other legislation that we've been seeing in the state level, there's been a number of states that have been targeting PBM contract practices. Some common contract practices that we've seen in various PBM contracts include things like copay clawbacks. Copay clawbacks usually occur when a patient's copay is like higher than the pharmacy's cost of the medication. So the pharmacy is essentially collecting the patient's copay, and the PBM is contractually entitled to claw back the money over and above any contracted reimbursement, and then retaining that as a profit. So we're starting to see states limit those. States are limiting gag clauses. Gag clauses for PBM contracts generally prevent pharmacists from talking to a patient about the true cost of a patient's medication. So, or the fact that like a less expensive alternative may exist. So essentially it places a gag on to prevent the pharmacist from telling the customers why they could pay less for a medication if they pay directly out of pocket versus going through their insurance. And another one is DIR clauses, which are direct and indirect remuneration fee clauses. So it's kind of a cover-all term that covers various monies that a Medicare Part D plan may cover and collect to offset member costs. So these are all things that are being directly targeted by various state plans. As last my count, over more than 20 states have passed laws that prohibit the predatory practice of PBM clawbacks and gag clauses in various contractual agreements. So this is one of those areas where it should really be closely monitored by stakeholders on the PBM side as well as on the pharmacy and healthcare plan side, because it has a real profound impact on the way that pharmacies and PBMs conduct business with each other. And we expect to see a lot more of this movement as time goes by, now that the Rutledge decision has given a little bit more flexibility to states to be able to directly regulate the costs. And with that, unless anybody else has something to add, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Royce and Kate.
Thanks, Tim. And we go on to the main slide here with hemp and marijuana versus CBD. Kate, did you want me to start here, or did you want to start?
Yep, why don't you go ahead and I'll jump in.
Yeah, so we bring this up in the presentation just because a growing part of our practice now for the three of us is cannabis. And when I talk about cannabis, I really mean the broad category of both what is hemp and what is marijuana. And this is a great primer slide right here that kind of gives the breakdown of when someone says the word cannabis, what do they really mean? And what do they mean when they say CBD? So going back a couple of years, 2018, Congress passed this thing called the Farm Bill, which simply legalized hemp for growth and distribution in the several states. And there's some conditions there about what is hemp and what is the technical definition of hemp. But the easy one is it's a marijuana plant, cannabis plant actually, grown with a 0.3% or less THC content of Delta-9, another distinction point, on a dry net basis. So we've got hemp, it's legal. If it's grown under a state plan or USDA approved grow, and from hemp you can extract cannabinol, which is CBD, or cannabidiol, it's a tongue twister, which is one of many different kinds of cannabinoids that you can find in a hemp plant. Marijuana is legal at the state level, but is still a controlled substance. It's, federally, it's legal in very, very unique circumstances. With a Schedule I, only people that really have those Schedule I permits are pharma companies. There's a giant pot grow at the University of Mississippi. It's where you get all the federal marijuana. It's horrible. But that's the legal marijuana. The federally illegal marijuana is the stuff that you are hearing about every single day. And that's grown in California, Illinois. Basically, any state that has a medical or recreational program is going to have a way for cultivators to grow marijuana as well. And that's the you can also derive CBD from marijuana, but the CBD that may be derived from marijuana that you're going to find in the dispensary is not going to be the kind that you're going to find at Whole Foods or elsewhere. It's going to be a much more potent kind. It's not going to get the protections of the Farm Bill because it was from a marijuana crop, not a hemp crop. And we're just raising that distinction point there because when we get to talking about CBD, it's important to keep in mind the setting of where the product comes from, how it's going to be used, and at a base level, whether or not it's coming from hemp or marijuana. And, to confuse things even more, there's another, you can derive from hemp food products that are not CBD, and we'll get into that distinction in a second. You can get seeds, fiber, other things from a hemp plant. Think about Dr. Bronner's shampoos, the magic shampoos there. They have hemp in them. There's also, hemp and flaxseed granola bars. So parts of the hemp plant that aren't CBD are going to be legal for food consumption, but CBD is kind of in its own unique place with respect to FDA, and we can go on to the next slide. So the question we get a lot is, is CBD legal? And that's an evolving question. It certainly is legal to some extent as an isolated form if derived from hemp. The Farm Bill actually speaks towards hemp extract, which contains CBD. But where CBD is getting into the gray area and where we're seeing, it getting into more complexity is when it's added to food, drinks, supplements, cosmetic products. And that's where CBD's status gets a little bit more complicated, because everything from sugar to pepper to butter to any ingredient that you find in food has to be GRAS, generally recognized as safe. And CBD has never enjoyed that GRAS status. It just simply has never been recognized as safe by FDA, mostly because of the novelty of the ingredient. You know, before the Farm Bill, we had decades of a drug control program that would prevent even the ability to extract CBD. So because it's not GRAS, it doesn't enjoy the protections that other ingredients would, and when added to a food, it could make it an adulterant. It could make the food adulterated. It doesn't enjoy the protections of being a dietary supplement, which is where people often would like to place it. Dietary supplement is, you know, any nutrient that supplements your diet that would normally ordinarily be consumed, such as potassium, vitamin C, things like that. The problem with CBD in that category, though, is that it's the active ingredient in Epidiolex for treatment of childhood seizures. And DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, which is the main rule governing dietary supplements, is pretty clear in saying if it's an active ingredient of a drug, there's no way it can be a dietary supplement. There's some, you know, there's some exception there to some extent with FDA with something like folic acid or, you know, high amounts of iron, but for the most part, CBD doesn't enjoy the ability to be a dietary supplement, both because it's not GRAS. Dietary supplements are food, they have to be GRAS, and it's an active ingredient in a drug. It has a chemical action on the body that's documented, and that drug carries a black box warning for liver damage. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, Royce, I mean, I'll jump in.
Yeah,
oh, yeah, I'll just jump in here real quick too. I mean, I think we get questions all the time from people that say, well, I see CBD on the corner, I see, you know, it's everywhere. How could you tell me that basically from the FDA perspective that it's technically not legal? It's in an extremely dark gray area. As many people may have seen, both FDA and FCC have sent out warning letters. Because the ship has left the force with CBD, FDA's primary enforcement focus to date has been on products where you are seeing kind of more egregious health claims, like the CBD oil will help your cancer, or the supplement will fix your arthritis. Anything like that is 100% low-hanging fruit for FDA to go after and ask you to change the product to take it off the market. The other ones, there's not enough FDA enforcement availability out there. So, you know, I know Martha Stewart just released a whole line, I think, of dog CBD treats, but at the end of the day, this is a very risky area to start putting your foot in and requires a lot of thinking. And Royce, I'll let you keep going with talking about the cosmetics.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can move on to the next slide real quick. So, you know, a lot of questions we get are, I get that CBD can't be in a food. I get that CBD can't be a dietary supplement, but, you know, let's make it into a cosmetic. And like look, there's some room there, but the reason there's a beeline to cosmetics is cosmetics have always been kind of this, like, you know, thing that FDA doesn't like that much, because Congress didn't give FDA much power over cosmetics. The FDA doesn't enjoy the same reform or the same enforcement abilities in the cosmetic space as it does with drugs, food, biologics, dietary supplements. Because cosmetics, you know, to just, you know, give a super simplified version of where cosmetic enforcement is, it's simply, if it doesn't melt your skin off, or if it's not on a list of, you know, ingredients that FDA doesn't like very much, you can probably make a cosmetic out of it. And there's no pre-market approval process for cosmetics except for color additives. There is this, invitation by FDA for cosmetic manufacturers to register with FDA, and we can talk about the merits of that, but it's the general rule is don't register. And other than that, FDA next bit of enforcement on cosmetics is, well, is it acting like a drug? And there's a great guide out there. If you email me, I can send it to you. It's where FDA differentiate, what's a cosmetic, what's a drug. Bar soap doesn't have any, doesn't kill bacteria, things like that, probably a cosmetic. Make a claim that the bar soap can, kill bacteria or, do other things. It's starting to get into the drug territory. It's really, what kind of claim are you making? If you're making a claim that the product can cure, treat, or diagnose any disease, then you're starting to drift out of your world of cosmetic and into drug. And the other thing, I get questions from clients and they're like, well, I'm not making those claims, but, here's a picture of someone in a hospital bed and they're taking my CBD product and, they seem radiant and wonderful. Well, that might be an implied disease claim. FDA looks at implication as well. So, telling you all of this, it's like, oh no, can I sell a cosmetic product with CBD? Yeah, we've seen enforcement discretion on the part of FDA when cosmetic products are not making the aggressive disease claims that other products in the space might make, such as, products that, have a different marketing approach. And we've seen FDA go after, just as we have in other areas of CBD, there's been a lot of enforcement on CBD products that make very overt claims, such as, can treat skin cancer or can reduce the pain of arthritis. And we've seen more discretion on the part of FDA if the product is not making as aggressive claims, if it's labeled accurately, if the product is, presenting itself more as a cosmetic and less as a drug. But that's a careful nuance, and, we can look over the product and guide on that. But if you're making a cosmetic, it's not as though it's a get-out-of-jail-free card with FDA. There's still considerations that need to be had. We're seeing recent FDA warning letters on topicals. We're seeing, aggressive marketing plans and advertisement positions from people in industry on some of these new cosmetics that are entering the market with CBD. And the other thing to keep in mind is FDA is just one enforcer in this space. There's FTC, which is going to enforce under the Federal Trade Commissions Act, which is looking towards enforcement for, is the evidence scientifically reliable to back the claims? That's kind of a generalization of FTC. But then we've also got businesses' ability to enforce, which is the NAD, the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. We've got the Lanham Act out there. I don't know if I've seen a CBD Lanham Act case yet. But then we've also got, an aggressive plaintiff's bar that is going after CBD products for claims either related to the product purity or related to the claims that the product is making. And these are all negotiable, but it's just important to realize that FDA is just one actor out there.
Great. Thank you very much, Royce. There's a lot to be thinking about in the CBD space if you're thinking of getting out there. And I think we are just at our time. We very much appreciate everybody joining. Thank you very much. Hope this was helpful, and everybody have a great afternoon. Feel free to contact any of us if you have follow-up questions. Thank you.